Taehyung, taking his seat on the plane, gave the cabin a quick once-over. Despite the business class status, the space between the seats seemed insufficient for comfort. The dim lighting and soft upholstery created a sense of luxury, but the cramped cabin irritated him. After some time, the plane hit turbulence, and a sudden jolt made him bounce as though caught in an air pocket. Out of nowhere, someone suddenly and firmly grabbed his leg just above the knee. Taehyung's gaze shot to the unfamiliar hand, and then he turned his head in surprise to see the owner. Jungkook sat there with his eyes tightly shut, his fingers gripping Taehyung's thigh as if his life depended on it. Taehyung, irritated. "You do realize your seat has armrests, right?" But Jungkook didn't respond. The plane jolted again, and his grip tightened. Taehyung could feel the warmth of Jungkook's hand squeezing his leg, making him momentarily hold his breath. Taehyung was a strict CEO, respected and even feared. His subordinates rarely dared to meet his gaze, let alone touch him. He couldn't even remember the last time someone crossed the boundary of personal space like this. Jungkook's breathing was uneven and heavy. Even through his black mask, it was obvious he was struggling with panic, fighting to overcome an inner fear. When the plane finally stabilized, Jungkook's hand was still resting on Taehyung's thigh. Those few seconds felt like an eternity. At last, Jungkook slowly opened his eyes. His gaze fell on his own hand, still resting on the stranger's leg. Realization washed over him all at once. He slowly looked up, meeting Taehyung's eyes. The beautiful but cold face in front of him expressed a mix of surprise and shock. Jungkook jerked his hand away as if he'd been burned and immediately began to stammer. Jungkook, embarrassed, quickly. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. I apologize." Shame washed over Jungkook like a tidal wave. If he could have exited the plane at that moment, parachute or no parachute, he would have done it. Taehyung said nothing, merely giving a slight nod, hiding how strangely affected he was by the touch. The large, frightened eyes of the stranger stirred an unfamiliar urge within him, to protect or draw him closer. It was disorienting. Jungkook pulled his cap lower over his eyes and tried to sink into his seat, attempting to disappear completely. He remained in that position for the rest of the flight. Hotel. Early morning. Jungkook happily stumbled into his suite, finally free of his travel gear after an exhausting flight. He barely had time to savor the silence and freedom before he heard a faint commotion outside his door. Frowning, he approached the door and cautiously cracked it open. Through the gap, he saw a small group of hotel staff bowing in front of his neighbor from the flight. Taehyung stood at the open door opposite, his expression cold. His voice, calm yet tinged with irritation, echoed through the hallway. "Taehyung, seriously? I can't wait 5 more hours in the restaurant. I want my suite." The hotel manager, visibly flustered, struggled to maintain a professional demeanor. "Manager. Mr. Kim, we've discovered a venomous spider in your room. We need to thoroughly inspect and remove any potential danger." Taehyung squinted slightly at the manager, his gaze sharp. "Taehyung, then find me another room." The manager sighed, bowing his head nervously. "Manager. I'm afraid all the suites are occupied, Mr. Kim." Listening to the exchange, Jungkook felt a strange mix of guilt and awkwardness. Remembering the incident on the plane, he made a sudden, impulsive decision to intervene. Jungkook, hesitantly, from behind the door. "You can stay in my room until yours is ready." For a moment, silence fell over the corridor. Taehyung turned his head, casting a brief, cold glance at the staff before striding toward Jungkook's door. With an air of ownership, Taehyung pushed past Jungkook, pulling his suitcase behind him, and entered the suite without a word, closing the door behind him. Jungkook stood in the hallway, momentarily stunned. Slowly, he stepped back inside, shutting the door, and realized he might have made a mistake. In the center of the room, Taehyung calmly removed his jacket, hanging it neatly on the back of a chair. Next, he loosened his tie, tossing it onto the table. Without saying a word, he lay down on the bed, flat on his back, occupying the exact center of it. Jungkook stood to the side, watching the scene unfold with a hint of shock. Jungkook, to himself. Why did I even offer this? Taehyung, lying on the bed, raised his head slightly. His gaze lazily drifted over Jungkook, who was still standing nearby, clearly unsure of what to do. Taehyung calmly. You have a nice face. Are you an actor? Or a singer? Jungkook blinked, momentarily unsure how to respond. He was used to being recognized immediately, even when partially hiding his face. Jungkook. I'm an idol. Jungkook. Taehyung nodded as if that answer sufficed and casually introduced himself. Taehyung. Ah, I see. I'm Mr. Kim Taehyung. Surprised by his formal tone, Jungkook let out a small scoff, muttering under his breath as he mimicked him. Jungkook quietly. Mr. Kim Taehyung, really? We're probably the same age. Taehyung's eyes narrowed slightly at the comment, but he chose not to respond. Instead, he turned onto his side, pulled a pillow toward himself, and hugged it like it was second nature. Within seconds, he looked as though he had fallen into a deep sleep. Jungkook stood there, feeling a mix of disbelief and confusion. Jungkook quietly. How can someone just fall asleep like that in a stranger's room? He stared at Taehyung, who shamelessly occupied the center of the bed. Deciding he couldn't let this slide, Jungkook walked over and lightly tapped his shoulder. Jungkook. Hey, that's my bed. Go sleep on the couch. But Taehyung didn't respond. His breathing remained steady, his eyes tightly shut, and it seemed as if he hadn't heard a single word. The blatant disregard irritated Jungkook. Taehyung's audacity started to get under his skin, stirring a sense of stubbornness. Scowling, Jungkook exhaled sharply, glancing around the room for an alternative. But the couch looked far too narrow, and sleeping on a chair wasn't an option he was willing to entertain. Gritting his teeth, Jungkook approached the bed. Taehyung remained blissfully unaware, still sprawled across the center. Resigned but determined not to give in entirely, Jungkook carefully perched on the very edge of the bed, making sure not to disturb his uninvited guest. His irritation slowly gave way to exhaustion. Despite himself, Jungkook began to relax. The tension in his shoulders eased, and his eyelids grew heavier. Before he knew it, he had closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep. A few hours later, the manager, deciding to check on his idol, tried calling Jungkook. After several rings with no answer, he sighed in exasperation. Manager, muttering to himself. He's not answering again. Of course. Either he's asleep or he forgot about his phone. Using a duplicate keycard, he unlocked the door to the luxury suite. As he stepped inside, something immediately caught his attention, a tie lying neatly on the table, something that didn't belong to Jungkook, and a jacket draped over the back of a chair. Manager confused. What the? Walking further in, he moved cautiously, his steps slow and uncertain. When he finally peeked into the bedroom, he froze in place. On the enormous bed, two people were fast asleep, tangled together. One had a leg draped over the other, and their arms were wrapped around each other, as though this was a regular occurrence. The manager instinctively bowed, assuming he must have accidentally entered the wrong suite. He murmured an apology and began to retreat, but after a few steps, something stopped him. His gaze landed on the tattoos on the arm of one of the sleeping figures. Manager in shock. Wait, is that Jungkook? Rushing closer to the bed, he stared at the peaceful face of his idol, who was nestled comfortably in the arms of a stranger. Completely stunned, he dropped his bags, and a loud thud jolted both men awake. Jungkook and Taehyung blinked groggily at each other before abruptly springing apart, each retreating to opposite sides of the bed. Taehyung calm but surprised. You're touching me again? Jungkook, equally indignant. You were hugging me. Taehyung. Why were you even in the bed? Jungkook firmly. Because this is my suite and my bed. I was sleeping on the edge. Taehyung snorted, casually running a hand through his hair. His voice turned cool and dismissive. Taehyung, I was hugging a pillow. At that moment, the manager, who had been standing frozen in shock, suddenly let out a loud exhale, breaking the tension. Manager, half laughing, half panicking. Oh, my heart! For a second, I thought you'd started dating someone while I was stuck on another flight. Both Jungkook and Taehyung turned to him, staring as though he had just said the most ridiculous thing they'd ever heard. Still flustered, Jungkook turned back to Taehyung, irritation and embarrassment written all over his face. Jungkook, gesturing toward the door. That's it. Enough. Go to your suite. Taehyung, completely unbothered by the chaos, glanced at his watch and replied coolly. Taehyung, my suite isn't ready yet. And I need to change. Before Jungkook could protest, Taehyung calmly got up and strode toward the luxurious bathroom, closing the door behind him without another word. Jungkook stood staring at the closed bathroom door, his mouth slightly agape. Jungkook, quietly, in disbelief. The nerve of this guy. Manager. Wait. Who is this guy anyway? Jungkook let out a heavy sigh, dragging a hand down his face as if trying to collect his thoughts. After a moment of silence, he finally spoke. Jungkook. It's a long story. Basically, he's my neighbor from the flight. There's a spider in his suite and I invited him to stay here. And now I regret it. The manager's eyebrows shot up in surprise. He seemed to expect more of an explanation, but when it became clear none was coming, he sighed. Manager. Hold on, his face looks familiar. He reached toward the stack of glossy magazines on the table. Picking up the top one, he froze mid-motion, his eyes going wide. The cover featured a striking close-up of Taehyung, accompanied by the headline, The Most Eligible Bachelor of the Year, Kim Taehyung. Manager stunned. No way. At that moment, the bathroom door swung open, and Taehyung emerged, now dressed in a simple white linen shirt casually unbuttoned at the top and a pair of shorts. His damp hair was pushed back with his fingers in an effortlessly elegant motion, accentuating his sharp features. The manager froze, momentarily struck by Taehyung's appearance, his professionalism faltering. Jungkook, snapping out of his own daze, nudged the manager sharply in the side. Manager, quickly recovering. Mr. Kim, you can't stay in the same suite as an idol. It's against the rules. You're welcome to stay in my room instead. Taehyung's eyes lazily flicked to the manager, his voice calm but pointed. Taehyung, is it a suite? The manager shook his head, looking flustered. Taehyung, then I'm not interested. The manager opened his mouth, trying to find a convincing argument, but Taehyung was unyielding. Manager, tensely. Look, you need to leave this suite. Taehyung ignored the protest entirely, sitting down in one of the armchairs with a composed air. Crossing one leg over the other, he gazed at the manager and said, completely deadpan. Taehyung, by the way, your idol harassed me. The room fell into a stunned silence, the words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. Manager shocked. What? Taehyung indifferently. While changing, I noticed marks from his hands on my leg. If you'd like, we can arrange a medical examination to confirm it. The manager let out an incredulous laugh, clutching his head. Manager, you can't be serious. He turned to Jungkook, hoping for some kind of clarification, only to see the idol standing in the corner, his face burning with embarrassment. Jungkook, muttering, flustered. It was on the plane. It was an accident. The manager slowly turned back to Taehyung, his expression a mix of disbelief and the dawning realization that arguing with this man was a terrible idea. A few beats passed before he forced the most diplomatic smile he could muster. Manager, awkwardly. Stay as long as you need. We don't want any issues with you. Taehyung nodded, as though this response were the obvious and only acceptable one. Taehyung leaned back in the armchair, completely relaxed, and gave Jungkook a playful wink. Jungkook, quietly, through gritted teeth. Unbelievable. Taehyung, smirking casually, glanced at the two of them. Taehyung, I'm thirsty. The manager, still nervously chuckling, nudged Jungkook toward the kitchenette. Manager, get him some water. Jungkook, indignantly. Why should I do that? Taehyung watched with amusement as Jungkook pouted but begrudgingly complied. Taehyung liked how Jungkook got riled up. Taehyung liked how Jungkook puffed out his lips. Taehyung liked Jungkook. The manager, glancing between the two of them, suddenly smacked his forehead. Manager, to Jungkook. Oh, I almost forgot. You've got a photo shoot at the beach in 2 hours. I'll go get everything ready. He grabbed his bag and quickly headed for the door. The door clicked shut, leaving Taehyung and Jungkook alone. Taehyung. So, what's it going to be? Should we head to the restaurant for breakfast or order it here? Jungkook, instantly tense, raised his eyebrows in protest. Jungkook. Why on earth would I have breakfast with you? Taehyung gave a faint smile, his tone calm and slightly teasing. Taehyung. Because I'd be bored without you. Jungkook rolled his eyes and stepped closer, leaning on the armrests of Taehyung's chair to glare at him directly. Jungkook, sarcastically. Need I remind you, you just accused me of harassing you? Aren't you afraid? Taehyung, unfazed, tilted his head slightly, studying Jungkook's sharp features. Taehyung. I just wanted to get rid of your manager. It worked. Jungkook, stunned by the sheer audacity, let out a frustrated breath. Jungkook. I have no words. Taehyung, still wearing his faint smile, didn't reply. He simply continued watching him. He enjoyed how Jungkook stubbornly pressed his lips together, how his eyes sparkled with intensity when he was angry. Taehyung, with a barely noticeable smile. Then I'll order breakfast for 2 to the suite. 15 minutes later, there was a soft knock at the door, and a staff member entered the suite carrying a tray with breakfast for 2. Taehyung glanced at the tray nonchalantly and motioned toward Jungkook. Taehyung. Come on. Breakfast is here. Jungkook, still annoyed, was about to refuse, but the loud growl of his empty stomach betrayed him. With a resigned sigh, he sat down across from Taehyung at the table in the living area. They ate in silence. At one point, Jungkook's gaze drifted downward, and he noticed a fresh bruise on Taehyung's leg, just above his knee. His heart sank. Jungkook's eyes locked on the mark, and almost instinctively, he slid off his chair and knelt beside Taehyung. Gently lifting the hem of his shorts, he discovered more bruises. Jungkook, quietly, almost a whisper. That must have hurt. Guilt washed over him as he tentatively traced his fingers along one of the bruises, his face reflecting genuine shock. Taehyung, unprepared for such a reaction, froze for a moment. His breath caught, and his gaze fixed on Jungkook, his heart skipping a beat. Jungkook suddenly pulled back and stood up quickly. Jungkook. I have some bruise ointment. We use it a lot after dance practices. I'll go get it. He hurried to grab a tube from his sports bag and returned to Taehyung. Without waiting for permission, Jungkook reached out again to lift the edge of Taehyung's shorts to apply the ointment. But Taehyung caught his wrist sharply, holding it firmly mid-air. Taehyung's eyes darkened, his voice dropping to a low, serious whisper. Taehyung, don't touch me. Jungkook, meeting his intense gaze, felt a wave of guilt and unease wash over him. Jungkook, almost pleading. If we don't treat them, they'll get worse. Taehyung tightened his grip slightly, his expression unreadable and voice unwavering. Taehyung, it doesn't matter. Jungkook opened his mouth to protest, but before he could, Taehyung, still holding his wrist, spoke in a quiet yet firm tone. Taehyung, you don't understand what you're waking up inside me. Very dark thoughts. Jungkook froze, his eyes widening as he processed the weight of Taehyung's words. He unconsciously held his breath, unsure of how to respond. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the buzz of Jungkook's phone vibrating in his pocket. The sound startled him, and he flinched slightly. Taehyung slowly released his grip, letting Jungkook's wrist go. Still dazed, Jungkook pulled out his phone and answered without checking the screen. Jungkook. Hello? Manager. Jungkook, get to the beach right now. The outfits for the photo shoot are ready. and you need to try them on. Jungkook swallowed, his voice coming out hoarse. Jungkook. Okay, I'm coming. Lowering his phone, he looked at Taehyung, who had shifted his gaze downward, appearing lost in thought. Jungkook hesitated, feeling an inexplicable tension in the air. Unable to think of anything to say, he turned and headed for the door. His steps were slow and unsure, as if his legs had suddenly turned to jelly. When the door closed behind him, Jungkook stopped in the hallway for a moment, running a hand down his face. His mind was in chaos. He couldn't figure out what had shaken him so much. Those words, that look, or the way his heart had started pounding harder than ever. The photo shoot was proceeding as usual. Makeup, outfit changes, and the constant buzz of photographers and stylists. Jungkook, well accustomed to this routine, easily slipped into character, flashing professional smiles and posing effortlessly for the camera. After the shoot, a group of fans managed to sneak into the restricted area. Jungkook immediately turned on his charm, smiling, signing autographs, and exchanging quick phrases with them. For a moment, his gaze drifted, and he noticed Taehyung standing nearby. Arms crossed, Taehyung was watching him intently, as though evaluating his every move. Feeling an odd urge to prove something, Jungkook turned up the charm, smiling wider and engaging more animatedly with the fans and photographers. He laughed a little louder than usual, throwing glances in Taehyung's direction. When Taehyung frowned and looked away, Jungkook felt a strange sense of satisfaction, pleased that he had unsettled the seemingly unflappable man. But the triumph was short-lived. A group of people approached Taehyung, clearly familiar with him. They greeted him warmly, some patting his shoulder or pulling him into brief hugs. Jungkook openly watched the interaction. His good mood evaporated the moment he saw Taehyung respond with a broad, genuine smile. His face lit up with a warmth that seemed completely out of character. And something about that unsettled Jungkook. He tried to refocus on the fans, but out of the corner of his eye, he noticed Taehyung glancing at him several times, as if checking whether he was watching. Taehyung, noticing the shift in Jungkook's mood, allowed a faint smile to play on his lips before turning and heading back toward the hotel. Jungkook, returning to the hotel with light makeup still on from the photo shoot, paused at the door to his suite. Taehyung was leaning casually against the wall, arms crossed. Taehyung nonchalantly. I don't have keycard to get in. Jungkook barely suppressed a smile but put on an exaggerated look of annoyance, letting out a theatrical sigh. Jungkook. Looks like I have to put up with you again. He unlocked the door slowly, and Taehyung, pleased, walked past him into the suite with a faint smile. Once inside, Jungkook turned on the large TV in the living room. An animated movie was playing. Movie voiceover. They love each other but are destined to live in separate worlds. You see, he's the king of dwarves, and she's a cursed princess. Only while the clock strikes 12 does she transform back from a sheep into a princess. Taehyung, sitting in an armchair, frowned and commented coldly. Taehyung, what nonsense. Instead of breaking the curse or fixing the problem, they just suffer. Jungkook shot him a glare, clearly annoyed. Jungkook. That's Whisper of the Heart by Ghibli. There's a whole story behind the clock. You obviously don't get it. Taehyung shook his head, his face still indifferent. Taehyung. I don't see the point in needless sacrifice. Jungkook let out a heavy sigh and grabbed the remote to turn off the TV. Jungkook. You're ruining the whole vibe of the movie. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. Taehyung immediately stood up and walked over, leaving Jungkook grumbling under his breath. He opened the door to find a housekeeper standing there. Gesturing for her to lower her voice, Taehyung leaned closer to listen to her whisper. Housekeeper, whispering. Your suite is ready, sir. Taehyung silently pulled out a $100 bill and handed it to her. Taehyung calmly. Say loudly that it's not ready yet. The housekeeper hesitated, frowning slightly. Housekeeper. I'm sorry, I don't understand. Sighing, Taehyung pulled out another $1,000 and handed it over without looking. Taehyung, slightly impatient. Does that make it clearer? Smiling at the money, the housekeeper raised her voice and said clearly, "Housekeeper, your suite is still not ready, sir." She bowed and walked away, still smiling. Taehyung closed the door and turned to find Jungkook approaching. Taehyung calmly, "Looks like I'll have to stay here a bit longer." Jungkook crossed his arms and squinted at him. "Jungkook, then I'll just stay in my manager's suite." Taehyung's faint smile vanished instantly. He slowly turned his head to look at Jungkook. "Taehyung, how many beds are in his suite?" Jungkook frowned slightly, caught off guard by the question. "Jungkook, 1. Straightening up, Taehyung replied with measured calm. "Taehyung, then stay here. I'll leave." "Jungkook, but you just said your suite wasn't ready." Taehyung, heading toward his suitcase, stopped and turned back. "Taehyung, I lied. I bribed the housekeeper." Jungkook, stunned. "What? Why would you do that?" Taehyung shrugged without a hint of remorse. He calmly picked up his suitcase and walked to the door. Pausing for a moment, he glanced back at Jungkook. "Taehyung, don't worry. I won't bother you anymore." With that, he stepped out, quietly closing the door behind him. A second later, Jungkook heard the sound of the door opening to the suite across the hall. Jungkook stared at the closed door but felt no relief. He'd finally gotten rid of his guest, yet instead of satisfaction, he was left with a hollow, heavy feeling. He slowly sank to the floor, leaning back against the door. His thoughts were a chaotic mess, and he couldn't understand why everything was affecting him so much. Jungkook, to himself. "Why do I feel like this? This is what I wanted." He sighed, burying his face in his hands, utterly lost in his emotions. Meanwhile, Taehyung entered his suite and sat down on the bed, closing his eyes. Inside, he was boiling. He couldn't understand why being around Jungkook made him lose control. Why his actions had become so impulsive, like a teenager trying to get someone's attention. Running a hand over his face, he exhaled quietly. Taehyung, to himself. "What are you doing to me, Jungkook?" Evening. Taehyung lay on the bed in his luxury suite, staring motionlessly at the ceiling. The time for his business dinner, the very reason he had come, was drawing near, but he felt no desire to get up or go anywhere. The silence of the suite was broken by a soft, awkward knock at the door. Taehyung slowly sat up, walked over, and opened it. On the other side stood Jungkook, looking as though he himself didn't quite understand what he was doing there. His gaze started nervously, and he held something in his hands. "Taehyung, leave while you still can." With that, Taehyung shut the door in Jungkook's face. A second later, there was another knock, this time more insistent. Taehyung exhaled slowly, reopened the door, but this time flung it wide. Jungkook, standing in the doorway, immediately extended his hand, holding out a tie. Jungkook, awkwardly, "You left this in my suite." Instead of replying, Taehyung grabbed him by the wrist, pulled him inside, and closed the door behind them. Pushing Jungkook back against the wall, Taehyung leaned in closer, his voice low. "Taehyung, you don't know how to take a chance to walk away, do you?" Jungkook froze, his wide eyes lifting to meet Taehyung's face, full of surprise. Jungkook softly, I just wanted to return your tie." Still holding his wrist, Taehyung's voice dropped to a rough whisper. "Taehyung, to hell with the tie." Without waiting for an answer, he leaned in and pressed his lips to Jungkook's in a fervent, desperate kiss. Jungkook went rigid, his body tense and breath unsteady. But he didn't want to leave. The tie had been nothing more than an excuse. He had spent far too long trying to think of a reason to come to Taehyung, and this was the best he could come up with. As warmth spread through his chest, Jungkook felt a dizzying rush of euphoria. They pulled away slightly, their heavy breaths mingling. Their eyes locked, and the distance between them seemed to vanish entirely. The pull between them was undeniable, an almost unbearable magnetism, as if something was pushing them to fall into this moment once more. The world around them ceased to exist until, suddenly, they were pulled out of the moment by the loud sound of Jungkook's phone, playing music from his pocket. They pulled away abruptly, and Jungkook heard his manager's voice from the hallway. "Manager, why isn't he here? Where is he?" Heavy footsteps approached the neighboring suite, followed by a loud knock on Taehyung's door. "Manager. Jungkook! Come out, I know you're in there." Taehyung rolled his eyes and strolled leisurely to the door. He opened it, looking completely unbothered, but before he could say anything, the manager pushed past him without hesitation. "Manager, where is he?" His gaze immediately landed on Jungkook, standing off to the side. His hair was disheveled, his lips slightly swollen, his eyes sparkling, and an almost imperceptible smile played on his face. The manager froze, staring at him with wide eyes. Quickly stepping closer, his voice tense and filled with urgency, he said, "Manager. No, Jungkook. No relationships. Your career will be over." Jungkook tried to focus on his manager's words, but his mind was scattered. His eyes kept drifting as though he couldn't fully grasp what was being said. Noticing his dazed expression, the manager waved a hand toward Taehyung. "Manager, wake up. You've known him for 1 day, and you've been building your career for 10 years. Are you really going to throw it all away for this?" Taehyung, watching the scene with a cool expression, stepped forward and spoke calmly. Taehyung to the manager, "Give us 5 minutes to talk." The manager, irritated by the interruption, shook his head furiously and grabbed Jungkook by the arm, pulling him toward the door. "Manager. No. Leaving you two alone was a mistake. I should have known nothing good would come of it." Turning back to Taehyung, he continued in a harsher tone. "Manager. He loves the stage more than anything. You seem like a reasonable person, so do the right thing and step aside." Jungkook, still overwhelmed, looked back and forth between Taehyung and his manager. The conflict in his eyes was obvious, but he couldn't find the words to respond. The manager, noticing his hesitation, sighed and tugged him further toward the door. "Manager, we're leaving immediately. The filming schedule was moved up, and we have 5 minutes to pack. Do you understand?" Jungkook cast one last glance at Taehyung, as though hoping he would say or do something. But Taehyung remained silent, his expression calm and unreadable. Once the door closed behind them, the manager turned to Jungkook, looking him straight in the eye. His voice softened slightly, though it was still firm. "Manager. Jungkook, this is just a vacation fling. Whatever you're feeling will pass in a week. You know that." Seeing his silence, the manager tried again, speaking more gently this time. "Manager. You know I'm right, don't you? Think about everything you've already invested in your career." Still, Jungkook didn't respond. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, and his lips were pressed into a thin line. The manager's logic made sense, but for some reason, it only made things worse. A month later, Jungkook smiled on stage, at interviews, and during every public appearance, doing exactly what was expected of him. But the moment he was alone, he felt like howling in pain. The manager's words about it being a fleeting crush had long lost their meaning. Nothing had faded after a week, nor even after a month. Instead, it only grew worse. After a long day of filming, Jungkook returned home and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Today marked exactly 1 month since he left the island. Memories clung to him relentlessly, and on the brink of breaking, he decided to leave the house. Throwing on a dark cap, a mask, and a hoodie, he headed to the nearest store. He bought several bottles of alcohol without notifying his manager or security. With a bag in hand, he made his way home alone, trying to avoid attention. But on the deserted street, a car suddenly pulled up beside him. The rear door swung open, and before he could react, someone pulled him inside. Panic overtook him as he began to struggle, but strong arms wrapped around him, holding him still. A familiar voice soothed him. "Taehyung," calmly. "It's me. Taehyung. It's okay, it's me." Jungkook froze, recognizing the scent, the voice, the touch. Tears spilled over, and though he shoved Taehyung at first, he quickly clung to him, hugging him tightly as if afraid to lose him again. Jungkook, through tears. You criticized anime. You said lovers should solve their problems, not suffer. I believed you, and I waited. But then, I thought you forgot about me. Taehyung, gazing at him intently, gently cupped his face with both hands, wiping away the tears with his thumbs. Then, leaning in, he kissed him briefly but tenderly. Taehyung softly. I never stopped thinking about you. Not for a second. Still crying, Jungkook whispered. Jungkook. Me too. Taehyung with concern. Why are you alone tonight? It's dangerous. Jungkook, surprised. Have you been watching me since the trip? Taehyung nodded, his gaze dropping slightly as if embarrassed to admit it. Taehyung. Yes. When it got unbearable, I came to see you. I watched you go home with security, with your manager. But tonight you were alone. Jungkook, quietly. I started to think I was suffering alone. Feeling his heart tighten, Taehyung pulled Jungkook into a tight embrace, holding him close. Taehyung, gently. I have something for you. Want to see it? Jungkook, slightly confused, looked up at him and nodded. The car drove for a while before turning onto a gated property in an elite residential area. Tall gates opened, and they approached one of the houses, a modern mansion with a spacious yard. Taehyung stepped out of the car and opened the door for Jungkook, gesturing for him to follow. Taehyung, come on, I have something interesting to show you. The interior of the house was minimalist but ready for living. Walking through a bright corridor, Taehyung stopped in front of two doors. Taehyung, this house is part of a secret project. It has 2 underground residential floors. And this door leads to the neighboring house. They passed through the living room of the adjoining house and exited through another set of gates. Jungkook, looking around, froze in surprise. Jungkook. What? How is this even possible? Taehyung crossed his arms over his chest, a faint smile on his face. Taehyung. The house used to belong to a government official, but I managed to acquire it. You can enter through your gates, and I'll use mine. To outsiders, we'll appear to live separately as neighbors in a luxury area, but inside the house, we'll live together. There's no risk for you. Taehyung smugly. So? Do you agree? Jungkook squinted, pretending to think it over. Jungkook, playfully. I don't know. Are you asking me to move in with you? Taehyung faltered for a moment, caught off guard. But Jungkook suddenly broke into a wide smile. Jungkook, excitedly. Of course I agree. Taehyung, letting out a relieved sigh. I'm happy to hear that. They returned to the car and sat back in the rear seats. Taehyung to the driver. To Jungkook's place. Halfway there, Taehyung pulled a business card out of his pocket and handed it to Jungkook. Taehyung, call this realtor. He'll arrange everything so your company and manager won't have any questions. We'll do it all the right way. Jungkook glanced at the card and nodded, smiling slightly, though still looking a bit unsure. Jungkook. Alright, I'll trust you. Taehyung pulled him into a tight hug, holding him close. His voice was soft but filled with genuine sincerity. Taehyung, you probably don't even realize how much I love you. Jungkook buried his face in Taehyung's shoulder, hugging him back tightly. His voice trembled with emotion. Jungkook. I know it because I feel the same. They looked into each other's eyes as Taehyung gently brushed his lips against Jungkook's. Their breathing grew uneven, and their emotions overwhelmed them. Each kiss was filled with tenderness, and the passion they had both held back for so long. The car glided smoothly through the quiet night streets, as if separating them from the rest of the world. In that moment, it felt like they were the only two people who existed. A few months later, Taehyung pulled up to his house, pressed a button on the remote, and drove through the gates into the courtyard. Closing the door behind him, he stepped inside, where he was immediately greeted by Jungkook, who wore an exaggeratedly displeased expression. Jungkook. I watched the live stream of the economic forum where you spoke. Taehyung, unable to hide his smile, walked closer and pulled him in by the waist. Taehyung, and what didn't you like about it? Jungkook, indignantly, meeting his gaze. I saw the way some of your colleagues were looking at you. Taehyung, taking in his sulky expression, felt warmth spread through him. He loved seeing Jungkook like this. Taehyung smiling. And what's your solution? Without saying a word, Jungkook grabbed Taehyung's shirt collar, pulled him closer, and pressed his lips firmly to Taehyung's neck. The kiss ended with a playful bite, leaving behind a bright, reddish mark. Jungkook satisfied. There. That's my mark. Now everyone will know you're taken. Taehyung tilted his head to the other side, a sly smile playing on his lips. Taehyung, in that case, shouldn't your marks be visible on all sides? Taking it as a challenge, Jungkook repeated the action on the other side of Taehyung's neck, leaving another bold mark. Taehyung closed his eyes, savoring the sensation as his breathing deepened. But suddenly, Jungkook pulled back with a mischievous grin. Jungkook, now everyone will know you're off limits. Taehyung raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a faint smirk. Taehyung, and what about you? Jungkook, waving a hand with a cheeky grin. I'm an idol. I can't have stuff like this. With that, he spun around and bolted down the stairs. Taehyung, shaking his head, didn't hesitate before following him. Soon, Taehyung heard Jungkook's voice echoing from the karaoke room. His singing was loud and carefree. Jungkook, locking eyes with Taehyung. Can you even imagine, Fallon like I did? For the love of my life. Leaning against the doorframe, Taehyung paused, watching him with a tenderness in his gaze and a faint smile on his lips. Taehyung, smiling contentedly. My jealous protector, and my greatest weakness,